Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project. I'm sitting down for a conversation with Kason from Disenthrall. If you're not familiar with Disenthrall, I'll leave some links in the description below so you can check out his channel, which I highly recommend you do. There's a lot of great content on there. Thank you, Kason, for taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Absolutely. Happy to be here, man. What's up?
Thank you, man. Yeah, we're just going to basically have a conversation about voluntarism, about the Nations of Sanity project. I'm sure Kason's got some good pushback and some scrutiny and all of that, so which I'm looking forward to. I always say that with voluntarism in general and with this specific idea that the Nations of Sanity project presents, I think that the true value of it comes out the more the ideas are explored and scrutinized. So I'm always happy for the opportunity to do that. And just before we do dive into it, for anyone who is listening to this, just in case they have no idea what the Nations of Sanity project is, the Nations of Sanity project is built on the assertion that the only way to create a truly free society with truly equal rights is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a universal peace agreement. Basically, we're saying that crime can and should be objectively defined by this universal principle rather than be defined by the arbitrary dictates of ruling authorities. And obviously that comes from a wider ideology known as voluntarism, which is built on this concept of self-ownership, which is simply the idea that everyone has right over only their own self. And we kind of go from there with our principles. So that's what this project's about. That's what voluntarism is roughly about. And that's what we're going to discuss today. So should we dive straight into it?
Yeah, so I wanted to, well, you actually covered it lovely as far as like, what does voluntarism mean? What is the non-aggression principle? So I guess probably the first thing, just for somebody who is unfamiliar with Disenthrall or anything that I'm up to, I think it's important just to say that I believe that you own your body and that no one can make you do anything with your body that you do not consent to, so long as you have not used force against them. So for example, I can't make you go and work for me in the field, and as long as you haven't tried to, say, kill me or something like that, right? So as long as you keep your hands to yourself and I keep my hands to myself, everything's hunky-dory. What do they call it? Kindergarten ethics or something to that effect. So I think that's important for people to hear. That's what I would define voluntarism as far as keep my hands to myself, you keep your hands to yourself. So your contention or your assertion was that the only way to have a group of people do that is to what specifically?
Well, I would just to refine it, I wouldn't say it's the only way for a group of people to do that, because I think a group of people can do that without the formal acknowledgement of or establishment of a law. But I think for us to have a society that's defined that way, for our society to be a truly free society, then on a societal level, I think we need to come to the formal understanding that the only law that we can justifiably enforce on everyone, regardless of their prior consent, is the non-aggression principle. And then any other kind of rules or standards that go beyond that, we could only obviously apply to people with their consent and agreement. You know, like, for example, you could join a club where we all agree to certain rules or whatever, but those rules obviously only apply to us that have joined the club. Whereas the whole idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as this kind of universal terms of peace is basically to say, look, it doesn't matter what club you're a part of or who you are or where you are, crime we're objectively defining as, by the non-aggression principle, and that is the terms of peace, the law as we all understand it, as I say, the only law that everyone can justifiably enforce on anyone and everybody. Does that make sense?
It does. I would only push back against, what do you mean by society other than a group of people? So how do you define what a society is? I think maybe that definition is still a bit muddled for me.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I suppose it doesn't really matter how we define the society. I suppose, I suppose it's just this, like when I'm thinking of groups of people, I was thinking of like smaller groups. Then I think the smaller the group, the more kind of the less formal understandings like that often need to be. I mean, the thing is with the non-aggression principle, it does kind of go along with most people's kind of day-to-day moral sensibilities anyway. You know, like we all kind of understand the non-aggression principle for the most part with our day-to-day interactions. The bigger disconnect seems to be when people think about government and stuff like that, as they seem to think it's some kind of exception to the rule. So I don't think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around the principle, and I don't think it's out of the question for relatively small communities where people already kind of have that understanding to be able to have that in an informal way. But I think the bigger the society gets, the more things need to be kind of clearer. Yeah, I think it's just, I mean, it's basically, let's put it this way, like if you were going to say what sort of society is this, you know, like say we're going on an economic thing, or we're going to say it's a free market one, or it's a communist one, or whatever, and then you start saying, okay, what does that involve? You know, when you say, okay, well, what's the society that you're advocating for? I'm not advocating for any specifics other than the free part of it. And it's okay, so what does that mean then? What defines it as being free? And I say, well, the only thing that defines that society as being free is if the recognized law of that society is the non-aggression principle. Because as I say, I do believe that's the only justifiably enforceable law, the only way we can kind of define crime objectively. So if that's established, you know, on a societal level, which has to be done in some kind of formal way, so people know what we're all talking about, you know, like, so we all have a universal understanding of what the non-aggression principle is, so we have a universal understanding of what the terms of peace are. It's, I mean, like I say, it's not a million miles away from what many other voluntarists, yourself included, are obviously talking about, because we're all talking about the same principles of the non-aggression principle and self-ownership. I suppose the only contention that kind of separates Nations of Sanity is this idea that we need to formalize this. We do need to formalize this in the form of some terms of peace that actually define our society, so that when any organization, be it a government, be as big as a government, or as small as a smaller criminal organization, as small as an individual even, they all understand the rules are the same for everybody. No one has right over anybody else, and then everything else can function under that kind of understanding. You know, like we can still have, I mean, because one of the things that's often, I think, strawmanned at anarcho-capitalist is the idea that, oh, so we can't have any kind of collective and you're preventing people that might want to have more socialist values from pursuing that. And the truth is no, if you're understanding the non-aggression principle, you can have your collectives as long as those collectives are without coercion, as long as they don't wield any authority over anybody else, as long as they're only, you know, literally applying to those that are literally agreeing to be part of it, then it's no different to any other kind of organization that is voluntary. And like I say, I suppose it's just getting this universal understanding of what is and isn't criminal, because we're not going to agree on everything else, but I think we need to get on the same page as that, and establishing this universal terms of peace, this universal law, I do see as the only way to do that.
Gotcha. So I think you mentioned something to the effect that people more or less believe in the principles of voluntarism, except when they have an idea of, like, how do we educate the young? How do we care for the old? How do we build the flat things? How do we guard the borders? Those things, there seems to be an exception in most people's minds, as far as, now I can do something other than, I can now control someone else's property to make that happen. So wouldn't that mean that they don't understand the principle at its foundation? Because if it's not a universal, then it's not really that. It's not the same principle. It's nice to be kind to people and not to take their stuff, but if you have a good enough justification, you ought to do it, right?
Yeah, no, that's a fair comment. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, yeah, I suppose the understanding that people have isn't really the principle in its absolute entirety. It's kind of like I suppose it's more when I introduce the non-aggression principle to people that haven't heard the term before, I suppose as I'm introducing it, they immediately recognize it as that, like you say, that schoolyard morality that you learn as a child, you know, don't hit other children, don't steal other children. They haven't, you know, they perhaps haven't articulated it in their head to the sort of degree where they're really thinking through the foundational principle and all the rest of it. But so it's very much, yeah, I mean, it's very much an incomplete version of the principle. But there's enough of it that when you then tell them about the principle itself, they recognize it because it mirrors onto certain moralities that they have. And perhaps, and again, the point of bringing this principle to their attention and making them think about it on this principle level is to not just show them where they already go along with it and where it already connects to their morality, but also shining a light on where they've failed to apply that principle consistently and where their morality has betrayed that principle. You know, I mean, because the other thing about it is when I talk to people about this principle, I find the important thing is to help them understand that things that they already assert, like the moral foundation for that, like most people, for example, if you're talking about rape, theft, murder, assault being crimes, and obviously being violations of the non-aggression principle, people are like, okay, yeah, obviously they're crimes. And I think, okay, well, why are they crimes though? If we want to step back and think, well, what's the moral foundation behind that? Like, what's the difference between rape and sex? The mechanics are the same. You know, why is there a difference? Well, with the concept of self-ownership, you have your difference. When you understand that this person has right over only this person, only himself or herself, and the other person likewise, you know that the only time that they can engage in any activity, whether it's sexual or otherwise, is with the consent of both parties. So again, it's providing this kind of universal definition of crime where most people already kind of understand what crime is in that kind of context. You know, they understand that that's why rape is wrong, and they also understand that the same principle also tells you that's why murder is wrong, and why assault is wrong, and why theft is wrong. And then all you need to do is wake their eyes up to the fact that government don't have a right to tax us because they don't have a right to rob, or they don't have a right to assault us, you know, when they're enforcing laws that step outside the non-aggression principle, and et cetera, all the crimes they commit. You know, I mean, obviously we do need to expose the blind spots to them, and how, and you're right, they're not really with the principle because they're not with it in the full way, but I think they're with it enough already, and with the things they learn, most of them learned from a young age, and at least, like I say, and how we conduct ourselves person to person, because even though they might forget it when they think about government and government policies they might even support, they don't usually forget it when they're dealing with, you know, from individual people. They're not trying to impose that themselves, even if they might be voting for things that impose it, you know. So
I would like to be hired. You must pay me $15 per hour, or else I will attack you and throw you in a cage. I have never heard someone say that, but I've heard plenty of people being like, fight for 15, vote for an elected official who'll guarantee a minimum wage of $15 an hour. I've heard that rhetoric. So yeah.
Well, exactly.
Interesting how it flip-flops, you know.
But I think that's important as well, because I think, and again, part of this idea is trying to get people to really understand what law is. Because I mean, I've had debates about people with regards to like drug laws, for example. Like, it's a pretty easy sell talking about how it's wrong to criminalize cannabis users, but then when you talk about other drugs, people are a little less keen to kind of get on the end drug laws, you know, bus, so to speak. You know, you talk about things like heroin or something like that, and when they give me that pushback, I say, but do you, even if you think it's, you know, the worst thing in the world and all the rest of it, do you really think that people that do it are criminals for doing it, for putting something in their own body, as harmful and as terrible as that might be, and as much as you might even think it has a, you know, a greater effect on society or whatever? And then they kind of step back and say, well, no, I wouldn't want violence used against them and all that. And I'm thinking, well, that's what it means when you make something illegal. That's what law is. And that's the point. And that brings it back to this whole non-aggression principle thing, because that's what law is. That is, it's not just rules that you're agreeing to with consenting people. Law is rules that are being forced on you without your consent. And because of that, my point is the only thing we can do that with is the non-aggression principle, because by definition, it's only a defensive threat of force. It's like, you know, if I say to you, if you smoke weed or if you gamble or whatever it is that I want to arbitrarily dictate to you, I'm
drinking from yellow cups,
whatever. Yeah. If I do these things and say, okay, I'm going to use force to stop you, then I'm obviously threatening you and violating your rights. But obviously, if I say to you, hey, Kason, I'm going to use force to prevent you from rape, murdering, robbing and assaulting other people, I'm not, like I say, it's a defensive threat. It's not a kind of, I'm not infringing on your freedom because you don't have the freedom to do those things, or your rights because you know what I mean. So I suppose in my head, and this is why obviously, like, you know, push for scrutiny and stuff, is in my head it kind of, it all fits. You know, if the non-aggression principle of the law, no one's got a complaint. No one could complain that their freedom is violated. There are little kind of wrinkles that I think we do iron out with the format of the peace agreement, which we can perhaps go into the 3-part peace agreement, because there is still the issue of like fuzzy edges with regards to interpretations of the non-aggression principle, and the argument of, well, if everybody's equal, who's to say when it comes to these fuzzy edges? And, you know, I mean, who has the authority to say which is the right way? And that's why I think we need to establish a slightly lower resolution version of the non-aggression principle that is kind of drawing the line at the black and white, and then basically saying, look, if it's truly a grey area, then it is unenforceable as part of this universal law, and that's something that would have to obviously be established through voluntary collectives and things like that. But as what we can all enforce on anybody, no matter what they've agreed to beforehand, we have the non-aggression principle, and I don't think anyone could argue against the fact that we would have the right to do that, you know.
Well, as far as I know, the non-aggression principle of "thou shalt not initiate force on other people" is the only thing that I've heard that's universalizable, e.g., it can happen at any time, and it works with all people, even people who are incapacitated or asleep. Compared to, you know, I've heard some principles that don't fit that universal standard of you only own something when you're using it. It's like, well, if I take a nap, I'm not using it, so now I don't own it. I don't even own myself. I'm taking a nap. I'm not using me. What do I do? You know. So I guess when I'm hearing what you're saying, I'm thinking, are you advocating the idea of like running for a political office and then saying, hey, this is the only law I'm going to pass and I'm going to repeal all the others? Or what do you mean whenever you say nations of sanity?
Okay, well, this is why I always emphasize that it has to be done through a peace agreement, because it couldn't be done, like, you couldn't run for government and then through the authority of the government say we're making this law, because by the very principle that you're trying to apply as law, the government has no authority to make the law in the first place. I mean, this is why I say that it's not, because I mean, and the thing is, it's sometimes I say terms of peace, sometimes I say law. I'm basically saying the same thing, but often when I say law, it often confuses people, because law has only ever been applied by ruling authorities in history. You know, like, that's how we know law to exist. Either governments or kings or queens or whoever's been in charge has said this is the law. Now, my point is doing it through a peace agreement, we're not saying this is the law because I say so, or because you say so, or because any authority has the right to say so. In fact, obviously, the principle's basically making the opposite claim, that no one has any authority to say this. But what we're saying is because we have this universal understanding that everybody has right over their own self, then because of that, this is the law. Because of our understanding of that basic reality. It's kind of like saying, to create any kind of society, good or bad, cohesive or otherwise, we have to have a basic understanding of reality. You know, if you came across some person that wouldn't even agree that we're like entities, individual entities, you know, they're just saying, oh no, it's all one, man, you know what I mean, or something like that. You know, I mean, if they're not even prepared to agree on it, you've got to have some kind of agreement on reality. And I think that minimum level of agreement on reality just simply needs to include the moral acknowledgement that every person has right over their own self. And with that alone, like I said, that's all you need. Once you've got that acknowledgement of self-ownership, everything else is actually self-evident. Sometimes it needs a little bit more sophisticated thinking. You know, something like rape is perhaps more obvious than perhaps property rights, which need a little bit more thinking, but they're still as objectively true. You know, like you can take self-ownership and you can get property rights nice and objectively from that. Because if I have right over only my own self, and I create something without harming anybody else, without, you know, doing any violation along the way, then obviously what I create is mine. It's my labor. I own my labor. And the other thing about self-ownership is that has that mirror combination of rights and responsibility. Whatever you have the right to do, you also have the responsibility. So I have the right over my action, which means I can obviously profit from, you know, the labor I produce, the house I built or whatever. But I also have responsibility over my actions, in which case, if I commit a crime, I'm criminally responsible and what have you. So, or for example, if I built some property that was then say caused harm to somebody, I couldn't then claim a disconnect. Just as I'm claiming property ownership as it being my property, I've also got that responsibility that it's my property. And if I built something that then killed somebody, even if it was accidentally, I would obviously be responsible for that, even if it was on a negligence point of view rather than a malicious intent point of view.
So here's a question for you. So I'm an anarchist. I'm a capitalist. I do my own business, and I'm prone to activism from time to time. What, in your view, ought I do starting today or tomorrow that would be different than what I already do, which is pretty much I live my life, and if somebody's curious, I'll talk about what I think. But other than that, I pretty much keep to myself. What is anything that I'm doing out of alignment with the Nations of Sanity project, or is anything I'm doing recommended to be tweaked in any way to, in your view, become more effective as an activist?
Well, the only thing I would add to your activism, Bo, is obviously the Nations of Sanity itself as and the idea, that I'm presenting, because I think that's a good idea. But no, I mean, everything about the way you live your life is, I mean, you are a voluntarist, to the best of my knowledge.
Silence, minions! Stay in your hole! No.
Yeah, unless you've got some secret slave dungeon in your basement, then I'm pretty sure you're a voluntarist. So no. And the thing is, sorry, excuse me. The thing is, the other point I make to people, because obviously I appeal to people who are already voluntarists and say, look, this is the idea of how we get the society we want. But I also try to appeal to people who aren't voluntarists to say, look, even the society that you think you want is actually better achieved in a kind of non-coercive way. I talk to people that are for example, people like that have a lot more of a socialist persuasion and stuff, and they talk about all the corruption in government and all the things that they want and that they want to contribute to that gets corrupted and funded off. And I'm saying, well, of course that's going to be the case. That's what happens when you're dealing with stolen money and an organization that's taking from you without your consent. But if you had a voluntary collective, if you had an organization where everybody involved wants to be involved, you're not going to have that corruption and bureaucracy, because that corruption and bureaucracy is part and parcel of a coercive system. So obviously plenty of people aren't going to want to be part of it, because plenty of people have that free market principles that we can just basically go in that, and we don't really need too much collectivization. But people who do want to explore collectivization, they can do so, and not only can they do so in a more effective way for them, but they can also do so without imposing on or harming others. And everybody can, I mean, again, that's the point. Is I suppose I try to be, my only kind of gripe with anarcho-capitalism, not that I really gripe with it, but my only kind of the reason why I personally don't identify as an anarcho-capitalist, and I prefer to say voluntarist, is because I think that's nice and neutral, and it's just concentrating on the voluntarism side. It's not even talking about an economic preference, even though I understand all the free market principles that make it an obvious economic model for a free society. But I think even that we don't need to do at first. I think at first we just need to say, look, self-ownership, we can all understand it. It's basically objective. It's like, as you say, it's the only universal principle that we could have. And this goes back to my original statement, which I think you're kind of confirming a bit with what you said, is I say it's the only way we can have equal rights. And as you say yourself, because it is the only right we can have equally, is the right over our own self. So I suppose the only counter argument that I can think of to that, which is an argument I have heard from other voluntarists, is, yeah, but we don't need your law to do that. We just need people to understand this principle and start living that way. And if we turn away from government, then that's how we'll evolve to a free society. But my problem is when you've got these big coercive organizations that are themselves, that have themselves collectivized, they have a power over us in our individual separate ways that we don't have. And I think we need to unify. And I think we need to actually, like I say, we need to formalize and establish freedom, because they're organized and we're not, or at least they're organized in a way that we're not, and they're united in their collective and we don't have any ourselves. And even if the only collective that we're united on is just this understanding of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, I think that's worth uniting on, because I think it's the one thing that everyone can unite on, even if we're different in other things, even if we've got different economic preferences. I mean, like I say, I've spoken to quote unquote socialists and progressives who now call themselves voluntarists, and they haven't changed their economic stance. They might do in time, they might have enough conversations with ANCAPs and, and all of that, because they're at least open to the dialogue now, because we're all talking within a paradigm of voluntarism rather than within a paradigm of coercion. And that, like I say, it's right that the left and right hate each other within a statist paradigm, because they are a threat to each other, because whichever one's got the reins is going to abuse the other, so sorry, I rambled on a bit there, but I hope you get my point.
Yeah, so I could. There's probably two ways that I could probably take this. One is along a pedantic path to firmly define capitalism. That could be fun. Or another way would be to offer some pushback on the concept of all people need to do is understand, or all people need to do is agree to these terms of peace. So which way would you like to go? I have both ways loaded
we
in
can
the
go
brain.
both. Why not? Why not do both?
All right, cool. So let's do the latter first then.
Okay.
So I would argue a third point that was not brought up. It's not that people need to understand, and it's not that people need to agree to a peace accords. To me, all that needs to occur is that people need to live by the principle and keep out of each other's way. Whether that is done through understanding, like some people I mention it to, and they're just like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'm an anarchist now." Like it's just that simple. They get it, and all of a sudden their actions change. Other people need a bit of a stronger incentive, perhaps something to more akin to a contract, or one might say a term of peace of which one must sign, or something to that effect. Other people need even stronger persuasion, right? So it just depends. But the fundamental success or failure of that project, I think, would be predicated on people abiding by the principle and not initiating force on another. Would you agree with the last part of that statement?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's needed even for what I'm proposing.
Sure, sure. So really, I don't know if there's a definite this is a win or this is not a win condition. Like I don't know if you're in business and you have a sales target, you can measure that because it's like how many things that I put in the bank. But with this, it's almost impossible to determine, other than maybe in your personal circles, your personal relationships, which I think Epictetus, the Greek guy, would be happy with, right? I think it was Stoicism, where it's like all that matters to you is what you say and what you do, because those are the only things that you can control. So it's like, for me, I'd wonder, how are my relationships stacking up? Are most people voluntarist, or are most people not? Or in layman's terms, are most people not willing to use force against me to do some kind of social thing that they want to get done, or are most people willing to send me to the gulag, comrade, if I'm not contributing to the plan? And I'm always questioning relationships and like, can I get a little bit closer to the voluntary side? That's a question that I'm asking myself. So what would be a win condition for you? How would you know, what, the Nations of Sanity, huge success? Or how would you know, what, the Nations of Sanity, I wasted my time? How would you know, personally?
Well, I mean, like I said, I do believe in that goal. I do think we need that formalized, established understanding. Like I say, like the three groups that you mentioned, like the group that's basically already voluntarists and living that way, they're not really affected by this. I mean, if this happened tomorrow, their life doesn't change, except they don't have this great big government to worry about, but they weren't that worried anyway because they were able to live their relatively free life despite of it. But the problem is there's many of us that whether they're open to, whether they awake to the ideas or not, aren't in that situation. And I suppose it's kind of like, I like to use the analogy of slavery, and that's like, imagine we were in the days where slavery was still wasn't classed as a crime. It was still accepted, if you can possibly conceptualize it. And imagine in that society, I suppose the way I think about it, it's like, yeah, it's great if I was coming across all these people that are happy that are saying, look, we just need to not be slave owners. We need to understand, live our life that way. And that's great. And the more people that do that, that is great. But I want to abolish slavery and end it. And I want us to unite together for the sake of the people that are still, that can't have their freedom for whatever reason, because they're either unaware enough to take it upon themselves, so we just need to open their eyes, or because they're literally being stopped by the government that's literally screwing them over in some way or another, which is many people in many different ways. So I suppose that's the kind of that's the difference in my head. Just like with the slavery analogy, bringing it back to the non-aggression principle overall. And because don't get me wrong, I think it's great, the more and more, and the work of people like yourself and Lark and Rose of spreading this and getting more people to be voluntarist, it is important. I'm not saying that it's not, because it is, and we need that. Even for what I'm doing, we need that. Even for this idea, that's still needed. So either way, that is needed. But I suppose that my fear is that I don't trust it to evolution, even with the great work that's being done. There's too many organized, established, formal authorities, for want of a better word, that are running the counter program, the opposite to freedom, the immoral law. It's like I mean, the reason why I don't shy away from using the word law, even though it can be a bit divisive amongst anarchists and that, because they associate it with statism and that. But the reason why I don't is because I think it is about law, because that's what's been corrupted by government. Our whole concept of crime as being something it's a crime if these people say so. No, it's a crime because of this objective reason, this basic moral truth that we can all agree on, that we all have right over our own self. We don't need anyone else's authority to come to that determination. That's why we don't need a government to establish this law. We just need enough of us to be able to establish it as a formalized understanding, like I say, like a peace agreement. Just, we understand these are the terms of peace. Anyone doesn't abide by this, we'll use force against you. Other than that, do what you want. It's just formalizing it, because as great as it would be for us to just evolve that way, I don't trust society to do that. I feel like, I mean, don't get me wrong, we might, the work of people like yourself in generations and generations, maybe we'll turn the tide, but maybe we also won't. Maybe the machineries using against us that are more powerful at the moment in many ways, certainly, with regards to the resources at their hand and all the rest of it, maybe they'll be able to keep enough people, because the thing is that, I don't know if you've heard the phrase, you can fool some people sometime, but you can't fool all the people all the time. My counter argument to that kind of hopeful comment is, yeah, but the people that rule us never needed to convince all the people all the time. Convincing enough of people enough of the time has always served them well enough. And that's what I want us to break. That's what I don't want us to just not practice slavery ourselves. I want us to abolish it so no one else can. And it's the same with statism. It's the same with anything that's a violation of the non-aggression principle. I don't want us to just live that way ourselves, as great as that is, but I want us to abolish it in this formalized way so that no one else is allowed to commit these crimes and oppress people and what have you.
So what does Nations of Sanity offer that a run-of-the-mill anarchist or voluntarist doesn't already do, or what does it add to the conversation, do you suppose?
I think only really that idea and that assertion. I mean, one thing I'm very clear about is, I didn't invent the non-aggression principle or any of these ideas. Voluntarism was a movement long before I was even aware of it, but I never understood. And I do think it is I don't want to criticize my fellow voluntarists, but I do think this is the kind of, it's like the elephant in the room for me, because when I kind of came across the ideas, I agree with much of it. And a lot of it, like, as I say, already spoke to the morality I already had. I just wasn't aware of these terms before and all the rest of it. But the one thing that just seemed like a kind of self-evident no-brainer for me is, well, then obviously this should be the law. We should all just, like, if we're going to overthrow our governments, then this is how we do it, by this one principle. This, like, rather than sort of saying, oh, well, let's try this idea, let's try that idea. It's like when I see ANCAPs and ANCOMs having debates on economics, apart from the fact that most quote unquote ANCOMs aren't really anarchists, but we'll put that to one side. The economic debate even annoys me sometimes, because it's like, it's beside the point. It's whether it should be forced or not. It's like when they're talking about whether co-ops are better than, it's like, okay, it doesn't matter. It actually doesn't matter which is better, because if you live in a free society, you can have a co-op and I can have my hierarchical business that works in the other way, and we can just live our ways. You can have a commune, I can have a free market. You know what I mean? It's everyone's a winner, and it's the only way everyone can be a winner in that sense. It's the only way, like I say, going back to my original statement, it is the only way we can all have equal rights. And I do think that is the only difference, though, because I mean, like I say, there's a lot of volunteers that are doing a lot better work than me with regards to spreading the principles and stuff, and reaching more people. And, obviously Larkham Rose, who works with you guys at Disenthrall a lot, is obviously a quite a well-known name who's reached many people. And like I say, I'm not bad mouthing that work. It's great work and it's important. And my work I feel like my work is almost identical to it. The only difference is this one idea, and I'm trying to sort of say to people, I think we should all get behind this idea, because I do think it's kind of like I say, for me, it's self-evident. This should be the law because it does objectively define crime.
Okay, so what would be your call to action to me if I were to help out with your? What is the call to action, so to speak?
Um, I have to admit, I'm a little bit weaker on this because the best I can sort of do to people is kind of just sort of say, well, look, join the cause in the sense of, if I mean, what I want from people with this idea is either support or scrutiny. So it's like, if you agree with this idea, then help me spread the idea to others and in that work that I'm obviously trying to do. And if you don't agree with the idea, then tell me why. Scrutinize it and tell me what's wrong with it. Because my assertion is that this idea is kind of, it has an objectively true foundation to it. So that assertion, I want people to obviously scrutinize and attack. And then my hope is when they kind of, after they've done that, the strength of it will be shown, and then they'll obviously jump on the train of sort of, I suppose all other voluntarists who are promoting self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, I just wish they added that idea to it, because that's what I'm doing, and because I do think that idea needs to be added to it. I just think the idea of, like I say, I'm not poo-pooing. It's great that we're teaching people about self-ownership and non-aggression principle, but a big question I got asked, and this is part of how I kind of decided to come up with the idea of the Nations of Sanity project, was a lot of people saying, well, okay, yeah, that all sounds great, but I live my life that way anyway. What do you want from me? You know what I mean? I'm thinking, well, yeah, we need to kind of get together and actually establish our society this way. We need to take our society back. I mean, at the moment, our society is under the control of criminals. We need to take it back. And I just feel this is a vehicle for doing that. That's a little bit more specific, a little bit more formal than the more loosey-goosey kind of let's evolve to it, as people, which, don't get me wrong, I still want to push towards, because that's plan B in my head. But plan A is I suppose I want revolution first, and then if not, I will support the work for evolution, not violent revolution, but revolution as in, let's get this done, but don't get me wrong, I do support the work to evolve ourselves to it by reaching people. And like I say, the work that you guys do and other volunteers do is really important for that cause. So I do fight for that too. But maybe I'm impatient. Maybe it's because I don't trust us to evolve to it. But I do just think that this is the missing link in what's going on with voluntarism at the moment. I just think we need that extra little bit of unified, okay, guys, this is what we need to do then. And at this stage, all I've got is my little 3-part agreement that I present, saying, okay, well, would be, if we had enough people to actually do it, this would be the way to do it. We need to, and just for you and for anyone else listening, the 3 parts of this peace agreement is, part 1 is the basic agreement to make the non-aggression principle the law, just that basic agreement. Part 2 is the lines in the sand, where we set limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. This is what I was talking about with the lower resolution version of the non-aggression principle, where we just enforce the black and white. And then part 3 is ratifying rightful ownership through the non-aggression principle. And all these parts are about is really just that understanding that we need to have of what the non-aggression principle is. Part 1 is just saying, let's agree to this principle, make it the law. That's great. But part 2 is getting that extra definition of, okay, well, what are we talking about? Where are we drawing the lines in these places? And then part 3 is saying, okay, well, what's the implications for property rights? And we can confirm, okay, well, this is how you rightfully own something. You acquire it through creation or voluntary trade, because that's how it works from self-ownership. And obviously through violence and violations of self-ownership, it's not a legitimate way to acquire ownership. And I just think if we get those 3 bits right, it's pretty much job done.
So I'm reading through on the website nationsofsanity.com, and then I clicked on the sanity agreement / the non-aggression agreement, and on it are the 3 parts that you just outlined. And I'm just kind of rereading, because I've seen your site before, and I don't know if the language has changed a whole lot, but it looks pretty similar. And let's see here. By agreeing to this, you agree that you cannot initiate force against people who have not caused harm or loss to you or another, or at least threatened / attempted to. So, like, I would be curious from the lawyer type side, not like a legal lawyer, but just like from the hair-splitting debater personality type that I am, like, well, what constitutes a valid threat? What constitutes a valid attempt? How do you know? Which maybe that's addressed, maybe that's not. but I think that would be a fascinating topic of discussion. Okay, I got to go on this pedantic rant on capitalism.
Yeah, go for it.
I got to do it. Okay, so a lot of people say that the opposite of capitalism is something more akin to socialism or communism. Would you agree with the general assertion that people say that?
Yes.
Okay, so I would, but I have friends who say that they're a voluntary socialist or a voluntary communist, and whenever I get to talking with them, I have, and this is covered on Disenthrall.me somewhere. That's the website if you want to go check it out. But we were talking with somebody who had Kim Jong-il as his user profile, and I was like, "Comrade, what do you mean you're a voluntary socialist?" And he's like, "Well, I think people should be free if they want to share their goods amongst one another and contribute to one great cause and blah blah blah." And I said, "Okay, I have a proposal. You're a capitalist." And he goes, "No, I'm not." And I go, "But you are, because I think capitalism, whenever people say it, is meaning that basically your directions are directed by you, not by the state." That's the fundamental difference from my understanding of the definition of capitalism versus socialism or communism. Now, if you self-direct to collectivize in some way, shape, or form, that's just a different flavor of capitalism. A weird capitalism to some people, but totally normal to others. I think that's fine. I think the kicker is whenever people say, yes, I'm a socialist and everybody must play by the same set of rules, or like they ought to be forced. It's like, well, then that's the dividing line. Earlier you were saying that it's a matter of whether or not somebody is agreeing to be a part of it or not, whether they're agreeing to share. So it's not so much how does that group or set of people interact with each other whenever they've all agreed to. What matters is if they're down the road and they see me at my woohoo capitalism business household and go, we're going to seize those means of production. That's the only thing I could be like, well, there's a problem now, because now it's not how are they interacting with those that agree with the way that they ought to interact. It's how do they handle disagreements and disputes, as far as, well, you don't own that, or we own that now. That would be the kind of the dividing line between what is a capitalist and what is some other flavor of economic interaction, which, whenever I'm saying economic interaction, I mean goods, services, money, whatever you call it. It's really how are you addressing you interacting with another person, right? So for me, I prefer to use some kind of medium exchange. I've tried crypto. It's getting there. Right now it's, money, currency, fiat currency, but crypto's on the way. I think that's pretty interesting, but it could be shark's teeth for all I care. Clam shells. I think I'd run into clamshell counterfeiters, but hey, it's not like fiat money's doing that much better. There's just more of them out there. And I think that's kind of the key difference whenever I'm talking with somebody about I'm an anarcho-capitalist and it's the only way to live a moral life. You can't change my mind, which is like the standard debate tactic to get someone to be like, ah! Because by the end I want to show them, no, you are a capitalist, or you're an authoritarian, in which case I want nothing to do with you, So does that pedantic rant change your mind about
no, in fact,
labeling yourself as a voluntarist or an anarcho-capitalist or anything like that?
No, not at all. I totally agree with your points and understand it. I mean, just quickly, the fear that you mentioned about these, let me use my quotation marks, voluntary socialists who may seize your property if the whim took them. That's part of why I think we need this formal understanding of what the non-aggression principle is, so that anyone that wants to call themselves socialists, who wants to live in this way of life that they might call socialist but you would call capitalist because it's voluntary, can do so. But any criminals who want to live a different way of life where they don't respect people's self-ownership or their property rights, again, whether they want to call them socialist, communist or whatever, need to be divided from each other, so that the people who legitimately are people who want to pursue, say, collective solutions, shall we say, within a voluntary paradigm, can be allowed to do that, and we can have conversations with them without worrying that they might actually be this other type of socialist who actually just wants the more common type of socialist, unfortunately, who wants to use the a criminal boot of the state. So like that's one of the reasons why I do think this formal idea of having this non-aggression principle established as the terms of peace is so important for situations like that. But just to touch on your pedantic capitalism definition, I actually agree with you. And I had a debate with David Friedman a little while ago about the definition of anarcho-capitalism, precisely because of what you're talking about. Because I mean, basically, he was arguing that anarcho-capitalism wasn't definitionally libertarian, and while he didn't think it was likely, you could have an anarcho-capitalist system that had, I mean, he mentioned drug laws and even mentioned slavery as a possibility. Now, I disputed this on two fronts. The stronger front was the anarcho part. I thought, well, both slave owners and people enforcing drug laws are basically acting with the authority of some kind of ruler, therefore they are violating the anarchist part. And I think that's a pretty self-evident. But also, which might be less self-evident, but I think is also true, is the point that you raised, that it also violates the capitalism part. Because all capitalism really is, when you get down to its dictionary definition, is simply private ownership of property. And that's just in accordance with property rights. So yeah, I do understand what you're saying, and it's funny actually. I had a conversation with, and I might have mentioned to you before, but I had a conversation with a progressive voluntarist, like, and I mean a real voluntarist who I had the conversation with about what voluntarism entails and agreed, you know, about no coercion and all that. But he still had progressive values. He still wanted to pursue, you know, these sort of collectives, and I offered up an idea of how one could work within a voluntary system. So, okay, well, theoretically, you could have a collective that operated, say, like, and even say had a regulated market and all of these sort of things, you know, and just spoke about how it would be done, but it wouldn't wield any power over other people that weren't involved with it and what have you. As I was describing it to him, I think I remember describing it to you, and I've described it to other ANCAPs who, like you, have said, well, that's capitalism. It's still capitalism, even if you're not operating with this profit incentive like a traditional business model. It's still capitalism because it's voluntary interactions within a free market, and that alone makes it capitalism. But I can understand why, in the progressive mind, in another mind, particularly people that associate, because not everyone understands the proper definition of capitalism, and it's got a lot of different definitions in different people's heads. But I can understand why people would look at that and say, well, no, it's socialism because it's socialized. It's, you know, they've collectivized, they've taken the profit motive out of it. They've decided to collectivize the costs, collectivize the benefits. There's no, like, you know, it's not a traditional business model in that sense. So they don't call it capitalism in their head, because capitalism, I mean, often these are the people that will say a capitalist is a business owner and the workers aren't part of that, and you know, and they have that divide in their head, but they've got a different conceptualization. And I suppose my point again, but even though I agree with you on that, I'm going to stand firm on my better to say voluntarism than capitalism thing, because when I say voluntarism, it's explicit what I'm talking about. If I say capitalism, even though you're technically right, rightly or wrongly, because of all of the different, you know, conceptualizations that people have of capitalism, they get the wrong idea, and then they start thinking about you imposing an economic preference. They start thinking about all the other things that they associate with capitalism, which may or may not be justified. And I just like to be clear. I mean, it's even why I don't even like using anarchism, because even then people think, oh, you know, like people have conceptual, like, yeah, Molotov cocktails being thrown into car windows and stuff, you know. So I just think, well, look, voluntarism, it's so explicit, it's clear, it's as uncorruptible as a word can be. It's as, you know, it's as possible to, the only time someone misunderstood what I was talking about when I said voluntarism was they thought I meant volunteering. That's the only time it's ever been misunderstood, and I don't think that's going to be too big a hurdle to overcome. But you know, whereas capitalism, I do think you struggle with, and even anarchism, I think you would struggle with.
So maybe this is just a personality difference, because you can absolutely do that. I was just curious kind of what your thoughts were, because my personality is one who loves to debate and stir the pot and make some havoc, right? So I want people to be like, what, an anarchist? You want all of our society to be torn apart at the seams? I'm like, baby, you're so wrong. Let me show you why. Like, I love that. I live on that. That's enjoyable to me. But I agree. If I'm at a business meeting and people are like, are you a libertarian? I go, no, I'm a voluntarist. And they go, okay, and they move right on. But if they said, are you a libertarian? Because I'm like, hey, yeah, you know that extortion money that we all paid last month, you know, they're like, what? This guy must be a libertarian. And I'm in a pretty Republican state in Texas. I'll be like, no, if I said, no, I'm an anarchist, they'd be like, oh my God, put this man in a cage. It'd be really surprising to most people. So yeah, I get it. That's kind of like the incognito mode for me, where it's like, hey guys, I'm a helpful voluntarist compared to I'm the crazy anarchist. But I mean, really, to me, they're all the same.
Yeah.
And just roll from there.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think if you're having if you know you're going to have the conversation with someone like one-on-one, then yeah, call yourself an anarchist, have the debate with them, correct them on what it really means. Same with capitalism, great. But when you're trying to spread a message to people, like I say, anyone of a left-wing persuasion is not even going to listen to another word you say as soon as you identify as a capitalist. Whereas they might listen to a few words if I say voluntarist. You know what I mean? Maybe not many more, but a few, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. It's like, it's getting through those barriers. And I just feel like I say, although I understand where you're coming from, because sometimes it helps to actually kind of almost provoke a kind of, oh no. And then you can explain to them how they misunderstood the word they fear so much, you know? So no, there is merit to that approach. I will grant you. But I just think that for the kind of more the more wider appeal where we're trying to reach out to everybody, I just think voluntarism works, not just because it's not divisive, but just because it's so more explicitly clear. It can't even be it's not likely to be misrepresented, because the problem is there are people who call themselves capitalists who misrepresent capitalism. It's not just the commies that strawman it, you know. There's even people that have called themselves anarcho-capitalism, you know, as my debate with David Friedman's shown, that haven't quite gotten on the voluntarism train. So I just think voluntarism's that a little bit more explicit. And even though I do agree with you about the proper definitions of anarchism and even capitalism, there are so many people that don't. And like I say, I think rather than having these long debates over, well, if you really look at the definition of capitalism and all the rest of it, voluntarism is nice and simple. It's, yeah, self-ownership, you own you, I own me, and that's all you need to understand. And then we can still have the economic debates, because I do think that's important. I think, you know, even in a free society, we want it to run as well as possible. So we don't want, you know, we don't want disastrous communes that fail and all of the rest of it. But the thing is if people have the freedom to pursue things, then they're going to be more open to things that you're peacefully offering them as alternatives, rather than things that you're trying to force on them through the barrel of a statist gun.
Cool. I mean, I got a couple minutes left. I'd love to tell people where they can find out more cool stuff that I'm up to. But
please do.
I should totally have them hear. Where should they go to hear more about the Nations of Sanity first?
Well, if they're watching this, they're probably watching it on the channel, which is Nations of Sanity YouTube channel, website of the same name, Facebook page of the same name, so easy to find. And I'll also put links in the description to both Nations of Sanity and also Disenthrall as well, so they can click on that nice and easy. So, but yeah, let them know where they can find you as well.
Yeah, so disenthrall.me, you can check out, we have a host of, almost 2,000 episodes of anarchy-based content, ranging from walking around in chains and slave outfits to get our passports to leave the plantation known as America to go to Anarcho-Poco, to carrying guns to feed the homeless people in Texas, because it's illegal if you're more than 50 people or you're feeding more than 50 people to do that without permission of our lords. So fuck them. Also, just a couple things that I think, you know, kind of like how you're trying to better the world through the principles of Nations of Sanity, I'm trying to better the world by helping some other people. So I'm going to highlight them. Yeah. Peaceful Parenting University, Patrick Smith teaching people about how to parent your kids peacefully to hopefully have a mind of a child that's not looking for an authority figure to tell them what to do. Okay?
For those future generations.
Right. So that's a long-term strategy. Attendcandles.com is Larkin Rose's website, where it's how do you talk about things like anarcho-capitalism or voluntarism without making someone go and freak out or run away. That's attendcandles.com. And wealthbattle.com, which is a new one with Lisa Manfredi, teaching people how to be better capitalists, whether that be earning more money, saving more money, how to do business, all kinds of different things. That one has a free offer. I think you go to join the free Discord and you get to play board games that teach you how to be an accountant, because that's what everybody wants to do on a Sunday night. But I learned a lot from it, so I would recommend it. So anyway, that's kind of all the calls to action. That's all the pimping I gotta do right now. So.
Yeah, no problem. Well, like I say, we'll put links in the description anyway, because it's nice and easy for people to just click on it then. So I'll put that on the description for anyone who wants to click on it and check that out. And I highly recommend you do. Yeah, and also you mentioned also the homeless people. Is it Feed the Need? Is that what it's called?
Feed the Need is the specific event in that particular case, but we've done other events. So Feed the Need is a Don't Comply event. Don't Comply is a group that advocates, not complying with government edicts whenever they go against your moral conscience. But we've done other events as well. Like for Patrick's birthday, we had a Freedom and Bovinity Festival, where we went out and we grilled steaks for homeless people. It was hot. It was really hot by the grill. But, at the same time, there was like 50 people that were armed, and the police would just drive on by. They wouldn't come over and slap handcuffs on. It's like, yeah, I got a shotgun and I'm feeding somebody some steak. Don't get between this man and his steak or I will fuck you up. Right, anyway.
Yeah, no, that's great work. Yeah, I mean, like I say, I recommend people check Disenthrall out anyway. But in particular, the Feed the Need is really important work. I think you guys do great work there. So big up yourself. Right, well, I think we're at our hour, so I'll just say goodbye to everyone. Thanks for listening to us, and thank you, Kason, for taking the time. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.